Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Cope with Uncertainty, Safety, Predictability, and Control. I'm Leah Carnath, the Program Manager for SOS Signs of Suicide, an evidence-based prevention program used by thousands of middle schools and high schools throughout the country. I'm excited to introduce our presenter, Nancy Ginty Butler, the Coordinator for Program Development at the Riverside Trauma Center. A seasoned family therapist with more than 20 years of experience, Nancy has focused much of her career on suicide prevention. For 15 years, Nancy has also worked in and managed a school-based counseling program for middle and high school aged youth. Fun fact, Nancy was also featured as an expert in our new SOS videos, which were released this school year. Both SOS and the Riverside Trauma Center are part of the Behavioral Health Innovation Division of our parent organization, Riverside Community Care, which is based in Boston, Massachusetts. And over the past few weeks, our partnership has become even more important with the spread of COVID-19, as we work to bring relevant and appropriate resources to the communities we serve. Before we get started, let's go over some housekeeping. So a few questions came in. Please note that everyone is muted automatically. We will have time for questions at the end of the webinar. You can feel free to use the chat box located in your controls to send questions at any point. If we don't have time to get to your questions, you can contact sos@mindwise.org. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be sent to all registrants. So if you're encountering any technical difficulties, I would encourage you to watch the webinar recording when it's emailed to you. With that, I would like to turn it over to Nancy. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Leah. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and I'm so glad that you're here. I have to say this is probably one of the larger audiences I've ever spoken to in the trainings I've done. And as much as I miss being able to be with people in person, there's something to be said for not being able to see you all in front of me right now in terms of handling nerves. So we're gonna talk, I'll probably plan to talk for 20-25 minutes, and then hopefully that will leave us plenty of time for questions and really speaking to what's on your mind today. And I just want to preface this by saying, first of all, I know the vast majority of people here are probably coming from the education, academic field. And I know it's been an incredibly stressful time for all of us, but I know in particular for our educators, it has been unprecedented in terms of, the ask to convert from teaching, for many of you who are teaching remotely or virtually right now, that transition, incredibly difficult. By the way, there's about 509 people in the audience right now. I just saw that question come in. And my gratitude goes out to you for the work that you have all been doing to support our country's children in this time. It's just, I'm very grateful for all that you're doing. And I know it's also been very stressful in terms of a lot of scrutiny has been pointed in your direction. And we'll talk a little bit about what that's about, particularly from families and parents. We can try to explain that a little bit to help maybe figure out if there's ways to mitigate that or how to respond to that directly. But I'm very grateful for all of you. So, and thank you for joining. I also, I think you'll probably find that a lot of what we talk about today might be in some ways intuitive, that these are things, we're all experiencing a high level of stress right now, given what's going on. And I'm hoping you'll find that what I offer you is a way to frame it for yourself and also perhaps for the students, for your colleagues, on how to talk about what's going on, to give you language around that. So that's my hope for this conversation today. And I look forward to hearing a little more from you and your questions of what you'd like to hear. So let me jump into the material. I'm going to sort of lay a little bit of the groundwork first on before we get into specifics around this particular time of uncertainty. What are just sort of some general basics that would be helpful to know about stress and uncertainty? So first of all, what is stress? Let's define it. When we think about stress, and I ask you to define stress, more often than not, what I get back when I ask live audiences is it's negative, it's pressure, it feels bad, it's really uncomfortable, And generally things with negative connotation. So that's totally understandable that that's the way that our brain typically remembers stress, that it's an uncomfortable, unpleasant feeling. But what's really important to remember about stress is that it has a purpose. It is a normal physical response to any kind of perceived threat to our survival or any kind of demand on our system. Stress is what allows us to meet demands. It's what allows our students to prepare to take a test and to do well during that test. It's our body's way of preparing ourselves to be able to encounter and then overcome and be successful against adversity. So there's a functional purpose for stress, and it's not always negative. There's generally 3 types of stress, as one way to think about it. There's positive stress, which often is how we experience as brief, maybe increase in heart rate. There's mild elevation in stress hormone levels, possibly. There's where our body's just sort of getting excited. That might be like if you're thinking about the experience of getting ready for a first date or having to hand in a paper. Our body finds ways to get our systems up and ready to complete that challenge. Tolerable stress would be a similar kind of reaction, but it's maybe a more higher level of physical response. So maybe more of our heartbeat is faster, our breathing is more rapid, our muscles are tensing up. This might be what we experience, say, if you're in traffic and you get cut off by a car and your foot slams on the brake, that there's this sort of very quick response where our body goes into action to protect ourselves. That's tolerable stress. You'll notice in the slide, it also talks about how it's buffered by supportive relationships. So that's where the structure of our life, the people around us, things that we have in place, maybe predictability, our routines, our structure, come in place to help bring that stress response down and help us return us to our baseline level of functioning. Toxic stress is the prolonged activation of the stress response system. So that's when we have a reaction to something and our stress response system doesn't necessarily return to normal in any kind of quick time period. Perhaps we have exposure to something over a period of time and our stress response system, our stress hormone levels continue to go throughout our body, our heart rate continues to be elevated, or maybe we don't have these protective relationships in our life that bring that down. And so we're going to talk a little more, piece that out a little bit more, because for a lot of us right now, we're experiencing in between the tolerable and the toxic levels of stress. It's toxic stress that often leads to people experiencing trauma. That's what often for people gets translated into the experiencing something as traumatic. It cannot be overstated the importance of these protective relationships. And when we think about the SOS program, and even right embedded in the mnemonic of ACT, acknowledge, care, tell, right there, we're addressing this idea of one of the ways that we help buffer people around this kind of toxic stress in their life is by providing supportive relationships. By showing we care, we're providing a protective and supportive relationship. So that's just, we'll come back to that, but that's just one way to set that up of why it's so important to find ways to maintain connection. So taking the toxic stress piece a step further, what is trauma? What is toxic stress? And so the definition is a level of stress that's so intense that it's overwhelming to manage and results in these overwhelming demands on our physiological system that results in these 3 things: this profound felt sense of loss of control, of vulnerability, and immobilization. So these 3 things are present in order for something to be experienced as traumatic or as toxic by someone. And if you think about that in the context of what's going on today with the physical distancing that's been put in place, with the virus being spread around, with the worry that people might be getting sick, certainly, probably you can think of examples of where people are feeling this loss of control. Suddenly people feel like the life that I thought was a certain way, there are factors that are going on, there are variables happening for me that I can't make them change by any action I can do. There's a sense of vulnerability for ourselves, our loved ones, our students, people in our communities, that we're not able to keep ourselves or our loved ones. Are we going to be able to keep ourselves or our loved ones from getting sick and dying from this illness? So certainly a sense of vulnerability. And immobilization. I can't get out of this situation. I don't know how to escape this threat that's in front of me right now. So certainly that's something that many people are experiencing as a result of the current crisis. I want to just take a moment to also recognize something that was put out by a think tank that we follow called the Center on the Developing Child out of Harvard University. Jack Shonkoff is the director there, and he wrote a letter addressing some of the concerns about this current crisis that we find ourselves in. And I just think we think it's really important at the Trauma Center to just convey these points and have them frame our discussion at all times, which is that those who are most vulnerable, there's a lot of words on the slide, so I'll summarize it here for you. But the idea is that those who are already most vulnerable in our society are going to be the ones who will be most impacted by this situation. So people who are already struggling with low wage work, working paycheck to paycheck, lack of affordable childcare. And we're talking specifically, if you're thinking about in the context of your work, if we're talking about students who have unstable housing, maybe violence at home, food insecurity, the burdens of racism or other structural oppressions, those are the people that are most vulnerable right now and at risk. Now, certainly it looks like across the population, we're all at risk of getting ill, but we need to be thinking about the particular vulnerabilities of people in that group when we think about how to help people cope with uncertainty, that there's an added layer for people who are already vulnerable in our society. And that in order to balance out those vulnerabilities or to begin to suggest how we approach those vulnerabilities, it's really important to think about both the physical separation as being absolutely necessary, but also as the Center on Developing Child put it, responsive social interaction is essential for strengthening resilience in the face of adversity. And so again, probably saying things that already are very obvious to many of you, but really thinking about how do we find creative new ways to have social interactions, to have connections with people in the face of this adversity, to strengthen their resilience. So continuing our discussion about stress and trauma and reactions, it's important just to take a moment and frame how all of the different domains that people have reactions on. So oftentimes when we think about stress, for a lot of people stereotypically, they think about the emotional domain where I feel upset, I feel worried, I feel uncomfortable, I feel shocked, I feel scared. And there's a huge wide continuum of feelings that people might experience. It could go from nothing, feeling complete numbness or feeling happy and fine, to very intense feelings on the other end of the spectrum. There's no specific recommendation around here's what's normal to be feeling right now. Each human comes to this from a different cultural background, from different personality backgrounds that might define how they express or experience emotions. And so there's no right or wrong. It's just important to know that there's a very wide range of typical. In addition, there is the cognitive domain. So people will often experience stress in what they think about and also how they think about. So for example, many of our thoughts right now are probably very much in the how am I going to keep myself and my family safe? How am I going to connect with my students? How am I going to connect with people I'm really worried about that are particularly isolated or in a dangerous situation? The content of the thoughts certainly would be impacted, but also how we're thinking is going to be impacted by stress. So for example, I have a really hard time remembering what I was going to do or finding words right now. So that's probably going to happen during this webinar where I'll try to think of a word and I can't find it, or I lose my train of thought, or I put things down and I can't remember where I put them. That might be kind of baseline for me on a typical day, but it's definitely happening a lot more frequently nowadays, recently, since we've all been doing this physical distancing thing. So short-term memory, difficulty concentrating, difficulty making decisions, very, very common for people in this time. People also have reactions on the behavioral domain. So that might be people finding themselves a little more irritable, shorter fused, arguing with people more often, distancing with people more often, feeling sillier than typical. Again, wide range of what's typical. In the physical domain, people might experience things like increased fatigue, exhaustion, headaches are really common for people. And sort of between the physical and the behavioral domain, I see a lot of people talking about sleep. And sleep being very disrupted for people, whether it be their sleep schedule, their ability to fall asleep, stay asleep, ability to wake up in the morning. A lot of people describing very vivid dreams. All of that is very typical for what we would see with people experiencing stress. Similarly, appetite changes, eating more or less than usual. might see relational changes in that domain. So feeling like the need to be by oneself more often might be more prevalent right now, since many people are not by themselves. For some people who are isolating alone, they might really feel like they need more relational time with people, anything in between. And in the spiritual meaning making domain, that's often for people who have a faith relationship. People will find themselves finding solace in that and comfort in that, and or lots of questioning around that. Like, how does my faith help me understand the situation as it happens? How does my belief in a God explain what's going on for me right now? And for other people, it might be more existential type of questions, like, why do these things happen to humanity? What's my purpose for being here? What can my role be? How can I be helpful to other people? Something like that. So that's just a quick review of the continuums. Again, I give this to you as a way to help frame for yourselves, but also if you're talking with a student and trying to help them understand what they might be experiencing, it's language to help people categorize what's going on. You know, often people don't think about the fact that they're having a hard time making decisions. It could be directly related to the stress that they're experiencing, and just having that knowledge and understanding can be very helpful. So now I want to talk about what we kind of do to help manage that. I'm going to describe our principles around trauma-informed care, of how we cope during uncertainty, and sort of the basic framework around that. And that would be with these principles of safety, predictability, and control. So let's talk about what that means. And we think about trauma or toxic stress being the experience of loss of control, vulnerability, and immobilization. Then the principles of safety, predictability, and control are direct ways to counter those experiences of loss of control, vulnerability, and immobilization. So when we talk about safety, what we're describing is this idea of, first of all, physical safety. You know, in general, I'll go back and talk about this specifically in COVID-19, but you know, do you feel more safe if you lock your doors at night in your home? Do you feel safer if you wear a seatbelt when you're driving? Do you feel safer if you walk with a flashlight at night? What are things that we have going on in our lives that help us not feel like our very well-being is at risk on a regular basis? And then there's also internal, emotional, psychological safety and relational safety. What do we do to help ourselves feel calm and grounded and centered? And how do we conduct our relationships and our friendships and our relationships with our colleagues and peers and students, so that we feel like there's some safety in that? So for example, in a school setting, safety and relationships might be, a lot of schools have exercises where they get to, you know, they go around and figure out, what students do we not have a connection with in this community? How do we make sure that every student in our community has an adult who knows them, who is connected with them in some way? And that's a way of providing a sense of safety. That's just an example. Predictability. We all have ways of structuring our time, of managing our routines, of conducting our days that help give us a sense of what to expect next. For some people, that's a very full Google Calendar with every half hour scheduled. For some people, it's a general routine. I get up and I have my coffee, and then I go and I do X, Y, Z. It varies on the actual items from person to person, but in general, not having to think about what comes next helps to filter out the worries that come from not knowing. So we often build in routines, we build in structures. And similarly, there's predictability from person to person. And that's where it's helpful to have continuity from person to person of behavior and expectations and rules and that kind of thing. And then control. When we talk about control, what we're talking about is one's capacity to make choices that change one's own life and environment. So, and for ourselves and for our students. So where do we offer opportunities for people to feel a sense of empowerment, to choose what they want to do from one moment to the next, within the limitations of what's possible and can be chosen in that. And within control is also the capacity to self and or co-regulate. How do we learn how to regulate our emotions so that we can also feel in control of ourselves? So let me also just talk, I'm just looking at the time here. Yeah, okay, so I just want to take a few minutes to talk a little bit more detail about that, make sure I leave plenty of time for questions. So during COVID-19, thinking about how this applies here in our here and now. So we talked about physical safety. one way to ensure physical safety right now is probably thinking more about following the guidelines of the CDC and other credible sources around how do we keep the virus from spreading so that we don't overwhelm the healthcare system. Is that washing hands more frequently? Is that wiping down surfaces? Is that through keeping 6 feet apart from people? That kind of thing. Similarly, we're also thinking though about how do we keep ourselves that resilience piece? How do we help to create opportunities that, because social isolation can also jeopardize safety. That can also present a risk for people. So I'm sure very much on your minds when you think about some of your students. So finding those ways to build that resilience, how do we break through the barriers of not being able to physically be together and still look for opportunities to reduce that social isolation that people might be experiencing? As I mentioned earlier about the people who are most vulnerable, how do we minimize harms from things like loss of income, lack of access to technology, which I'm sure is something that many of you may be struggling with yourselves or your students, living in unsafe home settings, loneliness, etc. How do we reduce unnecessary sources of toxic stress? That's a way to improve safety. So for many people, it might be limiting media exposure. The exposure to media and the news is definitely can be very stressful for people and at a level of toxic stress. And so to think about what type of media we're consuming and how much time we're spending consuming that media during the day for ourselves, again, and for students and people that you're working with. How do we increase that sense of internal and emotional safety? So here's some examples here for you on how you might do that. What are the self-care activities that we can engage in, that students can engage in? Yoga, mindfulness, dance parties, crafting, video games, hiking, whatever. There's an endless list of what those things can be, but really setting an intention of what people can do on a day-to-day basis to engage in those activities is important. As I've referred to already, that maintaining and fostering relational and social safety is probably the most significant determinant of how people do, of how people fare psychologically during and after these kinds of traumatic experiences. It's incredibly important to find ways to stay connected, to reach out to students who might be isolated, and to practice patience and kindness. There's a lot of data. You know, we think about the SOS program, which many of you are here because you're connected to that, a suicide prevention program. In the suicide prevention field, there's a lot of data about connectedness and how that can help as a suicide prevention tool. There's a lot of research that looks like even simply sending a simple card or a phone check-in to people following hospital discharge, for example, has a significant impact on reducing rates of future suicide attempts. So think about translating that here. Finding ways to connect individually with each student would be really important and helpful as a way to ensure safety in this time. When we think about predictability, so that would be, I sort of gave some examples already, and it's not vastly different during COVID-19. It's really about how do we translate it quickly and get up to speed right now. So what are rituals and routines that you or your school consistently do? And what are ways that you might be able to start those or maintain those during this time? Is there some kind of morning meeting check-in that can happen? Is there is there a way to have students check in via email about what they're doing that day and give you a plan? Is it Zoom, things like that? What kinds of schedules do you need for yourself to maintain during this time? And what kinds of schedules would be helpful for them? What are ways that help you feel as organized and it might help them start to feel organized? Is it through to-do lists? Is it through setting goals? And I think one of the things, as I'm also a parent as I'm coming to this, so I'm seeing this from several different perspectives, the clear communication piece with students and families when you think about predictability. So I mentioned at the beginning, I know schools have been getting a lot of criticism. And one of the things that's going on, I think, for families is in this time where they're searching for control, because our stress response systems are all overactivated, our brains start to point us to a place of what can we lock down control on? Actually, why don't I just jump into, I want to just show you this. Our brains start to lock down on what can I control? What's within my control and what's out of my control. And in that, our stress response systems sometimes our brains start to convince us that if we can figure out who's at fault here, then we can make this stop happening or we can change it in some way. And we know logically that that's not necessarily true, but our brains push us to try to look for the places to control. And unfortunately, sometimes what happens is people start pointing fingers at other elements that are happening and like, well, what must be happening here is that the school has broken down and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And if we can just fix that, then everything will be okay. That's sort of the like subconscious conversation that's happening for people in their brains. Again, we know that that's not necessarily true. And what would help, what actually makes this harder is if schools respond defensively. What we want to do is try to get to that part of the brain that helps regulate people and make them feel calm and that we're going to be okay and that we're going to help. We're all on the same team here. I'll come back to that a little bit in a second. But the clear communication is one way to help get to that calming, regulating place in people's, in our brains about, you know, first we need to regulate, then we can talk about learning, and then we can talk about what we're going to do. And so being really clear in what the content of the communication is, but also in trying to streamline what sources the communication is coming from is also very helpful. I don't know about you, but I have a lot of different communications coming from a lot of different directions right now, and it's hard to even like organize it all. So as much as we can help with that, it's going to help everyone we're working with. So I started, these aren't mutually exclusive. I already started talking about control, but one message to send, I think that's very important for you. And also I think it's really helpful for students to hear this as well, is that having reactions, having feelings does not mean that we are not in control. It is a normal, natural human experience for us to have a wide range, as I showed you before, of reactions, of experiences, and of feelings, and that is completely acceptable and okay. And sometimes what happens is people will have feelings and they start to judge themselves for that, of why am I freaking out right now? Or they start to, I must be weak, I must be not able to handle this. And they start, you know, all these judgments and shame and guilt start to pile in. And if we can just stop and remind ourselves this is a very stressful time. No one has ever experienced this in our generation, anything like that. And it's completely okay to have our feelings and reactions, to move through them, and then to get to the other side of them. And that is not necessarily not being in control, that's just part of the human experience. And we can let go of the judgments and the shaming and the blaming that we might be experiencing for ourselves or others around that. The other pieces of control would be, whenever possible, how can we give ourselves and our students choices, just like we would in the regular school day in the building. We can collaborate with them around how they make those decisions. That's so important to teach them the capacity to make those decisions, to have control over their own lives, and it builds their resilience. We certainly want to focus on strengths. We've been saying at the Riverside Trauma Center, what you focus on grows. So if we spend our time focusing on all of the things that are wrong and bad and that we don't have access to right now, that's gonna be what we're thinking and where we're oriented. If we can shift our thoughts and focus on, what did I learn today? What I now know, I'm sort of like an expert on Zoom, that I was not an expert on Zoom 2.5 weeks ago, the way that I am today. So that's something I can say personally that I have learned a whole lot. And I keep trying to remind myself of those things, and that helps me feel a sense of control. We know there's a lot of science out there about helping others in general as a way of building resilience and the capacity to overcome adversity. And so thinking about what are things that we can build in for students every day that is helping them help others. And similarly, these islands of mastery, and that goes back to my Zoom capacity. That's a great way to help people gain a sense of control. Is there a skill they can learn? Is it, you know, can they think about something they've learned about themselves in this time? And same for you, that you didn't know you were able to do before. You know, did you know you were going to be able to stay home for this long of amount of time with your family or on your own before this all happened? So, and the ending is to think about, we may be vulnerable, but we're not powerless. And that's so important to think about as a mantra. Mantras, I think, are very helpful in this time. I've been using also as a mantra for myself is just do the next right thing. To think about, like, okay, when I start to get overwhelmed and all of the big things are starting to come in, I try to clear it out and think, what is the next right thing right in front of me right now that I need to do? So that helps me regain a sense of control. I'm vulnerable, I'm not powerless, and right now I just need to do the next right thing, which is helping to get through all the content in this webinar so we get to your questions. So I showed you this already. This is a graphic that came from the counselingteacher.com. And we just thought it was a nice visual to share. You can Google this and find it too if you want to use it, to think about how do we help people who are more right-brained think about this? What are the things we can control? We control our attitude, we control our own social distancing, we control our kindness and grace with other people. We cannot control whether other people are following the rules of physical distancing. We cannot control how much toilet paper is left in the store, how long this will last, predicting what's going to happen. And so trying our best to let go of those things as we can. I mentioned what you pay attention to grows, and I just want to add that to this too, of like, we want to be able to think about this time as, how do we create healing stories? When we think back and we tell other people about this time in our country, in our world, what are the stories we want to tell about that? And we have the control over our story and the story of our students and the people around us and what that looks like. And how do we want to craft that? We have control over that. We can create a healing story that's positively oriented about how we coped with that, that we focused on strengths, that we learned things that we didn't know we could do, that we thank you someone for sharing the link to the visual, that we were able to get through this with grace and kindness and perseverance in the face of great adversity, things like that. So on a day-to-day basis, how do we embody that, and how do we help our students embody that? And lastly, I just want to spend a minute talking about self-care. At the Riverside Trauma Center, we talk about self-care as being an ethical obligation. As Malcolm X said, we can't teach what we don't know. We can't lead where we don't go. Charlie Parker, if you don't live it, it won't come out of your horn. So the point being that if we ourselves are not engaging in some kind of active self-care practice, even in the face of enormous stress and pressure and adversity, we can't ask other people to be doing it too, if we're not walking the walk. Now, to be fair, a friend of mine who also does similar kind of work said the other day, I know that we talk a lot about us as teachers, as educators, as counselors, as being role models, as parents, as being role models, and that we're setting the example for our students. And my friend said, if that was true, then why doesn't, then if it was true, then if I were to sleep, then my kid would just sleep by watching how I sleep, and my kid does not sleep. So there's exceptions, I suppose, but I would still say it's worth setting the example of how do we engage in healthy practices to take care of ourselves. And when we talk about self-care, just to be clear, it's not as simple as, do we do XYZ activity that's based around relaxation? It's three components, the three R's. There's reflection, taking time to reflect on our current situation, on our mindset, on how we are or not engaging in a healing story or a positive story, or calming ourselves down, or and also going back to our roots of like, why did I come to this work in the first place? Why do I do this work of my profession? Or what motivates me about the things I'm passionate about right now? Really taking time to ground ourselves in that so that we know where we're coming from. Regulation would also be spending time thinking about, how do we keep ourselves calm so that we can work from our prefrontal cortexes and not from our stress response, emotional response system. So regulating those reactions, being aware that those strong emotions are contagious, and really taking the time to calm ourselves down. If we had another time for a webinar, we could go into regulation activities, but what we're really talking about, deep breaths, body relaxation exercises, yoga, mindfulness. For some people, it's getting out and getting exercise, getting activity. There's thousands of different ways we can regulate ourselves, whatever works for you and your student. And then finally, the actual relaxation activities. So how do we make time for ourselves to relax and play on a day-to-day basis? Are we exercising? It's a simple things too. Like, I would love to ask, how many of you in the audience have a water bottle next to you right now? Just as an example, the simplest thing, I see some people raising their hand, that's great. How many people, the simplest thing that we can do right now within our control is to keep ourselves hydrated. And when we're hydrated, we're so much more capable of tackling lots of things. And it's just a simple act we can do to take care of ourselves on a day-to-day basis. It might not be officially relaxation, but how are we doing little things that we have control over to take care of ourselves? So I admit I do have a water in front of me, but I'm also drinking coffee, which is also, for me, very important. I just have to make sure I don't overdrink coffee, which is one way I can engage in my own self-care. Anyways, thank you for that. I'm going to stop there. I would love to hear what questions people have, what other thoughts people have. Leah, do you want to help me field the questions?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nancy, for the very informative content. We've been receiving a lot of positive feedback. So this is information that's definitely needed, especially during this time of crisis. So we have a few questions that have come in. One question that I can field, and then we'll have you give your thoughts as well. I was planning to do SOS this spring. What should I be doing? So I can answer that quickly and then turn it over to Nancy for additional thoughts. So our traditional SOS program, which includes a student video and depression screening, is not designed to be delivered virtually, especially during a time of crisis when students have fewer connections to trusted adults. So we're going to be hosting a webinar next Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern, which will walk through how youth can continue to benefit from the ACT message when they're no longer face-to-face with their friends or adults. So I'll put the webinar link in the chat box, so you'll also be receiving an email with upcoming webinars that you can register for. Nancy, do you have additional thoughts on that question?
No, I think that makes perfect sense. I think I think for right now, it's pretty tricky to think about how to give that in a virtual format. And I think it's probably best to wait until we've got it all sorted out.
Thanks, Nancy. And a similar question to that one. What's the best way to support students who are struggling?
Probably on a lot of people's minds right now. I just really quickly, if I can, I see one question that's come in several times is whether or not we'll share the slides. So I just want to address that really quickly so people who are worried about that can put that worry aside. Yes, we will send out a PDF of the slides. That's fine. We can figure out logistically how to do that, Leah, but I'm fine with that. How to support students who are struggling right now. So I think to take it back to the safety, predictability, control piece, to think about how can we operationalize that for some of the students who are having a hard time. I mentioned the idea about check-ins, finding ways to connect. We know that having a positive relationship with a supportive adult in one's life is the #1 protective factor against suicide. So finding ways to maintain and continue those connections is critical, I would say. Whether it be on, and also what's appropriate within your professional role. So like, for example, an idea just popped in my head is there a way to like connect with a student through an online forum, but obviously that has to be within what's appropriate and allowed within your professional capacity. So, to be thinking about that, what makes sense. But even in its simplest form, sending letters, postcards, a telephone call, an email, all of those kinds of check-ins are very helpful for people who are feeling separated from their community and isolated right now. And so just in any way, the content is almost, it's not as important as the fact of the effort of trying to connect, which really makes the difference.
Thank you, Nancy. So the next question we have is, since school is closed for a long time, how can we boost these concepts to last longer?
In terms of, I guess you don't have the context of the question. How do we boost these to last longer? It's probably about just the continuity of it. So setting up some kind of regular, predictable schedule where some of the same things happen over week to week. So I'm completely brainstorming out loud right now, but I'm thinking about like maybe on Monday, people find a way to post a picture of something that's giving them self-care right now. And then maybe on Tuesday, it's post a picture of something kind you did for somebody else today. Coming up with different themes like that to sort of extend those things out, and then making it a regular routine every week where students do something like that might be one idea. But I think back to some of it is also the safety, predictability, control, just being really clear with the communication and honest about it of, here's where we are right now, but we don't know that we'll be here next week and we can't make any promises about that. And just as much as we can, sharing what we know and sharing what we don't know and being clear.
Great, thank you, Nancy. This question comes in from an elementary level participant.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions for advocating to administrators who don't want me to use mental health language and even talk to students about worry?
So if we are not talking to students about worry, then I'm trying to think of how to say this diplomatically. When we're not acknowledging that worry is a real part of all of our human experience right now, then we are causing, we could exacerbate the worry that kids are feeling, because then we're adding a component where they might be trying to understand why they're alone in their feelings, and not allowing for that ability for them to talk about how to cope with the worry. We create more risk when we don't allow the conversation to unfold as it is, because we know, because we're not creating the opportunity to heal it or to resolve it. So that would be, I'm not sure that that's not politically, diplomatically honed for a conversation with administrators, but I think I would stay on that. And there's lots of research out there to support that. I mean, when you look at research around liability and standard of care, for example, that's the technical language around liability. The standard of care is that because we know that talking about it makes it better, any reasonable person in a similar situation would then say a professional should be talking about it. So if that helps, we can look at those links too, sharing some of that.
Thanks, Nancy. Another question just came in. What are your thoughts on balancing pushing students who are not doing necessary schoolwork, but also focusing on the positives?
I think this one's really tricky because it's going to be very individualized. Some students, because of their already underlying vulnerabilities, are not going to be able to do schoolwork right now. And some students are not capable because they're caring for their younger siblings so that their parents can continue working, or some students don't have, because the parents are either working from home or working in an essential service or who knows what, don't have someone structuring their time to get them to connect, to be able to get the work done and to push them through. And so it's very situation specific. And I think we have to think about, just like in any academic learning environment, then until we have our students regulated, for those of you who use the zones regulation, that until students are in the green zone, or until students are, that their stress response systems are calmed down enough that they can access their logic and reasoning and impulse control in their prefrontal cortex, then they're not getting any learning done anyway. So I would say that we have to back it up a step and start there of, how do I reach this particular student? How do I understand the circumstances around why they're not able to get to their schoolwork? Is there anything in that that's fixed? And is there anything in that that's flexible that we have some movement on? Like if it's fixed, like they literally don't have access to technology, so they can't do it. Well, that actually might be flexible. Maybe we can figure out a way to get them access to technology, and started trying to peel back the layers of the onion to figure out what are the things in this, what are the obstacles in the way for this student to get to their level where they can be a learner. We have to sort of go back and fix those issues first. And at this point, for some students, the priority may end up being that we keep them psychologically safe and socially connected to the best we can, as a priority over keeping their academics up. There are many school communities right now that are not doing any academic learning right now because of equity issues, because they can't advance some students if all of the students can't also advance together. So it's just another way of thinking about it.
Thanks, Nancy. So we have time for probably about one or two more questions. This question will also kind of be addressed in our next webinar next Thursday on ACT at Home, but wanted to turn it to you, Nancy. How can we screen students for suicidal thoughts during distance learning?
So I think it depends. Obviously, it depends on your role, and are you acting in a capacity as an educator, or are you acting in the capacity as a psychologist, a counselor or clinician or social worker, and what's your profession, and so how far you should be going with screening. It's completely okay to be asking similar questions over distance, in terms of acknowledge, care, tell. It looks like you're really having a hard time. I really care about you. I'm really concerned. A lot of people are having a hard time right now. Who else should know about this? What's going on for you? Who else can we talk to about this? Let's think about that a little bit. Remember that our most powerful tool in helping to support people who are struggling is in listening and connecting. So one of the things that sometimes people do is we jump into problem solving mode because we're helpers and we want to be able to help and get to a resolution, and it helps us calm our own anxiety. And so to pause and step back a little bit and see if we can just be listeners and try to understand what's going on. That sometimes in and of itself is really what people need. And so just connecting back to some of that, what we know about acknowledge, care, tell, and using those tools and skills, I think is is really important. And then the second piece I would say is to never worry alone. So if you are worried about a student in particular, just make sure that you're connecting with the colleague or the appropriate next person in the helping chain to get a second opinion on what to do on that. So that way we're never holding on to that stuff by ourselves.
Thank you, Nancy. And I think before we close, we had a question of if you would be able to show a quick example of a breathing exercise that people could rely on during these times.
I'll show you very quickly two of them. One is actually a tapping exercise. It's called the butterfly hug. And all you do is you have people make like a butterfly like that, or a bird, I guess it is, and put it right here on their chest and tap from side to side. It's more of a regulating activity, but it's, and while they're tapping, to just try to like take deep breaths and calming thoughts, and just do until, you know, just keep tapping like that until it sort of feels like enough. So that's one exercise. Another one would be 4 square breathing, and that's simply inhale for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, exhale for a count of 4, and hold for a count of 4. There's apps, they call that 4 square breathing. It's or tactical breathing if you're associated with the military, that's the term they use. And so there's apps for that if kids really like the technology piece, or you can just walk people through that. And you can even do both at the same time if that's comforting to you. We spend a lot of time doing this at the Riverside Trauma Center. So.
That was really awesome. Thank you, Nancy. Before I close out, is there anything that you would like to add?
I just want to add quickly, I just want to send a quick thank you to my colleague, Joanna Bridger, just to give credit. She also helped develop this training, and I also teach ethics to graduate students. And so I just wanted to make sure I gave credit where credit was due. Our clinical director, Joanna Bridger, helped with this training. So that's it. And I just want to thank you all for joining and for your great questions. And we're all in this together, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And just as a reminder, you'll be receiving an email with the recording and a PDF of the slides. Feel free to visit our website to learn about upcoming webinars, and we wish you the best, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everyone.